friends and I were hopelessly lost. In the fall of 2001, I was studying abroad at Oxford, and as part of a weekend holiday, me and my flatmates went to Paris for the weekend, and promptly got lost. This was difficult because, well, while I could read a map, I spoke no French. And quite some time ago, we had wandered off the tourist map that I had in my possession. We had someone in our group that was fluent in French, but hadn't the courage to speak it to anyone who spoke French. We had someone who was slightly fluent in French, but couldn't hold a conversation more past, a few sentences. But she was all too willing to have those few sentences with anyone. And so it was a great game of telephone as we walked down the street trying to get some rude Parisian to help us. Finally, we happened upon a 70-year-old man out for his morning constitution, a little beret and a cane, and just the happiest look on his face as he was wandering through, well, hopefully not as lost as us. We got to him, and we played a great game of telephone. I would have questions about the map, how to get back to this edge, which I'd known we'd fallen off of. I would tell it to the fluent French-speaking person, who would tell the slightly French-speaking person sort of what to say, and she would confidently express this to the Frenchman, who would then speak fluent French, he spoke no English, back down the line, and eventually we found our way. At the end of the conversation, he looked at us, took us all in and said, "Americans?" And we said yes, and shrugged, and he said, "High five!" As if that was the great summation of American culture to be encountered. So we all high-fived him and, got back to where we were. When I think of Pentecost, I think of that moment. Many denominations and many Christians look to this moment as a miraculous speaking in tongues. That somehow, some way, the assembled disciples acquired a mystical language that was understood by everyone. And there are places in the gospel, in the scriptures, where this sort of thing appears to happen. A mystical language that requires interpretation. But that's not what happened, it seems, at Pentecost. What happened at Pentecost is somehow the disciples acquired the ability to speak other languages, and others heard them in their language and understood them, despite the fact that these were a bunch of poor Galilean fishermen, a former tax collector, and God all knows what else. It wasn't so much, but I want to argue just briefly that it wasn't how they spoke that proved the miracle of Pentecost. It was what they said. So on the one hand, you have this mystical glossolalia, speaking in tongues, this possible speaking of a mystical language that somehow requires some interpretation to be instantaneously translated and understood, or this mystical sort of acquiring of a new language and then being understood by others. But like I said, it's not how they said it that is miraculous. The flames of the tongues of fire and the driving wind take care of the miraculous as well. It's what that conveyed. You see, my mind was blown when I was like, oh, they gathered for Pentecost. Wait, how did they gather for Pentecost when Pentecost wasn't a holiday yet? Well, Pentecost was already a holiday. It's a Jewish holiday. It's the Jewish harvest festival. The wheat harvest has been brought in, and the first fruits of summer are being gathered. And so it is one of the pilgrimage holidays. So this brings all the Jewish diaspora to Jerusalem for Shavuot, the festival of weeks. 7 weeks after Passover, or 50 days in Greek, Pentecost. We gather. So everyone is in Jerusalem for all-night Torah reading. The contemplation of God's mighty acts in history and their relationship to them. And in thanksgiving for those mighty acts, we offer the harvest and the first fruits of summer. Everyone's in town, Parthians, Medes, people from Mesopotamia, Jews and converts, Cretans and Arabs. They're all in town for this service. They're all in town for this celebration. And it's here as part of that festival that the disciples speak. They come not as this new mystical thing, but in full, living into the holiday, they preach God's mighty acts. How is it that we hear in our own language the deeds of God. The word megaleia, great things. How is it that we hear these things? This word is used earlier when Mary proclaims the Magnificat. The Almighty has done great things for me, and holy is his name. They're not only speaking in tongues, they're not only being understood. It's not only about how this is accomplished, but what is accomplished. They are preaching. They are declaring for themselves and for all what God has done in their lives and what God will do in the assembled crowd. That's why Peter stands up and says, you know what this is. In studying Torah all night as part of Shavuot, you know what this is. This is the prophet Joel speaking. This isn't a riot. This isn't a disturbance of the peace. This isn't, a bunch of guys drunk. It's only 9 a.m. This is what Joel, the prophet, told you was going to happen. In the last days, I will pour out my spirit on all flesh, and your young men will prophesy, and your old people will dream dreams. Declaring of the mighty acts of God is the miracle. There is language, yes. There is tongues of flame. But what all of that facilitates is talking about God's intervention in our own lives and in human history. And Peter will tell them of the ultimate intervention into their lives, Jesus Christ. It's not only how they say it, it's what they're saying for the first time to the world. And we too can live into that spirit of Shavuot and live into that spirit of Pentecost. Not only by speaking in tongues, although I don't put it past God to make that possible. And many of you are fluent in multiple languages. And that's truly a gift. But what does all that language, what does all that fire and wind, driving wind serve? To describe the mighty acts of God. Jesus says, I will send you an advocate, a comforter, to counsel you and give you hope. But also a spirit of truth so that you can declare it for yourselves and for a world in need. It is a very, very hard thing to talk across the divisions in our country and in our world. Political differences, religious differences, denominational differences, gender and identity differences. There are many ways that we have decided to carve up the human race and put each other into boxes. Some of those differences are almost linguistic barriers, where you almost have to be speaking a different language to talk with someone on the other side of difference. But God gives us a way to not only speak those other languages, but gives us the words to say. It's not only about convincing another person of your point of view, but sharing your point of view. The spirit of truth that is within you, giving you the power to declare what's going on in your own life, in the way in which God has intervened, the ways in which God broke addiction, God gave you a child, God helped you find love, God helped you find yourself, God saved you. These stories are more important than the language in which you speak. Fumblingly and however you can, wander the Parisian streets and speak the truth that has been given to you. And you will find, when you do so, when you cry, Abba, Father, you will find that very Spirit given to the apostles breathing through you. We all have different gifts. Some of us can read maps. Some of us can kind of sort of speak French. Some of us are confident despite the fact that we don't really know the language. And some of us are kind, beret-wearing Frenchmen helping deranged American students get back to their group. I think if we all take the little piece of the truth that is given to us and share it, the larger truths will take care of themselves. The differences that we have to talk across, that we have to move across, that we have to transcend, will be that much easier if we know what it is that we're carrying over those boundaries. The ways in which God has saved us. So contemplate then, not only the theological and miraculous of the holiday. How you might speak a different language so that it might be heard. But give some thought to what it is when you're given the opportunity you will say. How has God intervened in your life? How is God working in your life? And how might God, if shared with others, move our communities to justice and love? You've been given a spirit of truth, an advocate and comforter to give you courage and hope across division, across violence, across war. What will be the truth that you have to share? What will you speak so that we might find our way again? High five.